Colorado Territory, 1885. A woman descends from the westbound train onto the wooden platform of Cedar Ridge Station, her gloved hands trembling as they clutch a worn leather satchel containing letters promising love and acceptance. Off her face bears the angry red scars of a fire that stole more than just her beauty, scars that have made her invisible in a world that judges worth by appearance alone. She has traveled 1,500 miles, chasing the promise of a man who claimed scars could never diminish a beautiful soul, seeking the cabin and forge where Samuel Hartwell pledged to build their life together. But when she arrives at the coordinates he provided, she finds only charred timbers and cold ashes, until a voice calls from the darkness, rich and familiar, belonging to a man whose sightless eyes see deeper than any mirror ever could, and she realizes that sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from finding what we seek, but from being truly seen for the first time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Colorado mountainside as the narrow-gauge railway from Denver wheezed to a stop at Cedar Ridge Station. Steam billowed around the single-passenger car as Margaret Sinclair gathered her courage along with her modest belongings. At 24, she carried herself with the careful posture of someone accustomed to arranging her profile to hide the left side of her face, where angry scars traced from her temple to her jaw, a permanent reminder of the factory fire that had claimed her position, her home, and nearly her life 2 years earlier. The train conductor, a weathered man named Pete Jacobson, helped her down to the platform with practiced courtesy, though she noticed how his eyes skated away from her scars. She had grown accustomed to such reactions, the quick glances followed by studied avoidance, the way conversations ended when she turned her head and revealed the full extent of the damage. It was precisely this universal rejection that had driven her to answer Samuel Hartwell's advertisement in the Denver newspaper 3 months earlier. "Beautiful souls shine brighter than perfect faces," his first letter had proclaimed. "A woman's worth lies not in unblemished skin, but in the kindness of her heart and the strength of her spirit. I seek a true companion for life in the Colorado mountains, someone who understands that real beauty comes from within." His words had been a balm to wounds deeper than those the fire had left, promising acceptance she had never dared hope for. Margaret's correspondence with Samuel had stretched across 12 weeks of careful revelation. She had been honest about her scars from the beginning, describing the accident that had trapped her in a burning textile mill, the months of recovery, the way her reflection had become a stranger's face, marked by melted flesh and puckered skin. His responses had been consistently encouraging, sharing details of his blacksmith forge, nestled in a valley 20 miles north of Cedar Ridge, painting pictures of sunrise over mountain peaks and the satisfaction of creating useful things with skilled hands. "Your courage in surviving such tragedy speaks to a strength I admire above all other qualities," he had written. "The mountains care nothing for conventional beauty, only for the fortitude to thrive in their embrace. I believe you possess that strength in abundance." His final letter had included detailed directions to his property and a promise to meet her at the Cedar Ridge Station if she sent word of her arrival. She had posted that notification 2 weeks ago, allowing ample time for the message to reach him. Now, standing on the rough-hewn platform with her single trunk and carpet bag, Margaret scanned the handful of people gathered to meet the train. A rancher collected supplies from the freight car. A woman in a faded blue dress embraced a young man in work clothes. An elderly couple argued quietly about directions to their destination. None of these people matched the description Samuel had provided of himself, a tall man with dark hair and calloused hands who would wear a distinctive silver buckle on his leather belt. "Miss, you need an assistance with transportation," The station master, a thin man with kind eyes, had noticed her obvious search of the small crowd. "Most folks around here are helpful to travelers." "I'm looking for Samuel Hartwell," Margaret replied, adjusting her bonnet to better shade the scarred side of her face. "He operates a blacksmith forge in the North Valley. He was supposed to meet me here." The station master's expression shifted to one of concern mixed with confusion. "Hartwell's forge, you say? Miss, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that place burned down near 3 weeks ago. Lightning strike during a bad storm. Took the cabin, the forge, everything. Hartwell himself." He paused, studying her more carefully. "Are you family? Because if you're expecting to meet him—" Margaret felt the solid platform beneath her feet seem to shift like quicksand. "Burned? But I received his letter just 2 weeks ago. He was expecting me today. We've been corresponding for months about—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the humiliation of traveling halfway across the country to marry a man who apparently no longer existed, or perhaps never had. "I'm right sorry, miss. Sometimes mail gets delayed, especially from remote properties. And Samuel, well, he took off right after the fire. Haven't seen hide nor hair of him since. Most folks figured he went back east, or maybe up to Wyoming, where he's got some distant kin." The station master's voice carried genuine sympathy. "You got somewhere else to go? The Copper Bell Hotel in town can put you up while you sort things out." Margaret's savings, carefully hoarded from her work as a seamstress after the factory fire, would stretch to perhaps a week at a hotel before she would face the impossible choice of returning to Boston in defeat or finding some means of survival in this mountain wilderness. The thought of returning to the city, where every familiar face carried pity or revulsion, made her stomach clench with dread. Her sister's family had made it clear that her presence was a burden, her scarred appearance an embarrassment when visitors called. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Could you direct me to his property?" she asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I need to see for myself what remains. Perhaps there's some indication of where he might have gone." The station master looked dubious. "It's a fair piece up the mountain road, miss. Not really suitable for a lady traveling alone, especially this late in the day. Weather can turn sudden-like in these parts." "I've come this far," Margaret said with quiet determination. "I can manage a few more miles." The truth was, she needed time to think, to process this latest catastrophe in a life that seemed destined for disappointment. The physical journey might provide the mental space she required to plan her next move. After some discussion, the station master arranged for a local rancher named Bill Mackenzie to transport her and her luggage partway up the mountain road in his supply wagon. Mackenzie, a gruff man in his 50s with sun-weathered skin and gentle hands, asked no uncomfortable questions about her destination or circumstances, for which Margaret was profoundly grateful. The wagon ride took them through spectacular country that gradually climbed from the high plains into foothills, thick with pine and aspen. Mackenzie pointed out landmarks along the way, a creek that ran year-round, a meadow where elk gathered. In the evenings, a rock formation that resembled a sleeping giant. Despite her disappointment and growing anxiety about the future, Margaret found herself responding to the wild beauty surrounding them. "Country's got a way of healing folks," Mackenzie observed as they rounded a bend that revealed a vista of snow-capped peaks stretching to the horizon. "Don't matter what brought you out here or what you're running from. Mountains don't judge. They just offer opportunities for starting fresh." The comment struck deeper than perhaps he intended. Margaret had indeed been running, fleeing not just Boston's suffocating pity, but her own conviction that her scarred face had rendered her unworthy of love or normal happiness. Samuel Hartwell's letters had offered an alternative narrative, a possibility that someone might value her character above her appearance. Now that hope lay in ashes, as surely as his forge apparently did. They reached the turnoff to the Hartwell property as afternoon shadows began lengthening toward evening. Mackenzie offered to wait while she surveyed the damage, but Margaret declined, preferring to face whatever remained in private. She arranged for him to collect her in 2 hours, giving her time to explore and decide on her next course of action. The narrow track leading to the forge site wound through dense forest for nearly a mile before emerging into a cleared valley beside a creek lined with cottonwood trees. Margaret's first glimpse of the destruction confirmed the station master's account, where Samuel's letters had described a sturdy log cabin with a stone chimney and attached workshop. Only blackened timbers and scattered debris remained. A forge itself had been reduced to a pile of twisted metal and shattered stone, though the anvil stood intact among the ruins, like a monument to vanished dreams. Margaret walked slowly through the wreckage, her boots crunching on charred wood and broken glass. Samuel's letters had painted such vivid pictures of this place that she could almost see it as it had been. The workshop where he shaped iron into useful tools, the cabin where he had planned to hang her needlework on the walls, the garden plot, where they would grow vegetables together. Now, it was all reduced to ash and memory. She was examining what remained of the cabin's stone foundation when she heard the sound of metal striking metal, the rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil that she recognized from Samuel's descriptions of his work. The sound came from deeper in the valley, perhaps a quarter-mile upstream along the creek. Margaret's heart leaped with sudden hope. Perhaps Samuel had established a temporary forge elsewhere on his property. Perhaps her journey had not been entirely in vain. Following the sound through the gathering dusk, Margaret made her way along a faint path that paralleled the creek. The hammering grew louder and more distinct, accompanied by the whoosh of bellows and the hiss of hot metal meeting water. Around a bend lined with dense willows, she discovered a small clearing where someone had indeed established a working forge. The setup was primitive but functional, built around a natural outcropping of rock that provided wind protection. A leather bellows system fed air to a fire pit lined with stones, while a massive tree stump served as an anvil base. Tools hung from pegs driven into living trees, and a small lean-to shelter constructed of pine boughs offered basic protection from weather. The man working at this improvised forge was not Samuel Hartwell, unless her correspondent had failed to mention that he was completely blind. The smith was perhaps 35 years old, tall and powerfully built from years of heavy labor, with dark hair that caught the firelight and arms that moved the heavy hammer with practiced precision. But his eyes, pale blue in a face darkened by forge smoke, stared sightlessly past the glowing iron he shaped with such skill. Margaret stood at the edge of the clearing, uncertain whether to announce herself or retreat quietly. The man worked with such focused intensity that she hesitated to interrupt, mesmerized by the grace with which he maneuvered around his workspace despite his blindness. Every tool seemed to be precisely where his hands expected to find it, every movement economical and purposeful. Then he spoke without turning from his work, his voice rich and resonant in the mountain's stillness. "You can come closer if you like. The forge doesn't bite, and neither do I." Margaret started, surprised that he had detected her presence. "I'm sorry to disturb your work. I was looking for Samuel Hartwell and heard the hammering." The rhythm of his hammer strokes faltered for just a moment before resuming its steady beat. "Samuel's gone, has been for weeks." He thrust the iron rod he was shaping back into the coals, then turned toward her voice. "But I know that voice. I've been waiting for you, Margaret Sinclair." The shock of hearing her name from this stranger's lips left Margaret speechless for several heartbeats. "How could you possibly know who I am? We've never met." A smile played at the corners of his mouth, as he set down his hammer and moved toward her with the careful confidence of someone intimately familiar with his surroundings. Haven't we? How many hours do you suppose I spent listening to Samuel read your letters aloud? He was my friend, my only real friend in this valley, and he shared everything with me, every word you wrote, every hope you expressed, every fear you confessed about whether anyone could love a woman with scars. Margaret's hand instinctively rose to touch the damaged side of her face, a gesture so habitual she barely noticed it anymore. Samuel read my letters to you? Samuel couldn't read, the blind smith said gently. Neither could he write. Every letter you received from him came from my pen, though the words and feelings were genuinely his. I was his voice in your correspondence, just as you became his hope for the future. He paused, tilting his head slightly as if studying her with senses other than sight. My name is David Morrison. I've been living on this mountain for 5 years ever since. He gestured vaguely toward his sightless eyes. Samuel found me during my first winter here, half frozen and 3/4 crazy with grief and rage. He saved my life, and I've been helping him with his business ever since. The revelation that her entire correspondence had been filtered through this stranger's interpretation struck Margaret like a physical blow. Then everything Samuel wrote to me, all his understanding and acceptance, was Samuel's own heart. Speaking through my educated vocabulary, David interrupted firmly. I may have provided the words, but the feelings were entirely his. He saw your tintype photograph, the one you sent after describing your scars. Do you know what he said when I finished reading your letter explaining about the factory fire? Margaret shook her head, then realized he couldn't see the gesture. No. He said, tell her that a woman brave enough to write the truth about suffering is a woman strong enough to build a life with. Tell her that scars are just proof that we survived what tried to destroy us. David's voice carried a weight of memory and loss. Those weren't my words, Margaret. They were his, straight from a heart that understood pain because he'd endured plenty of his own. Tears began to blur Margaret's vision as she processed this unexpected testimony to Samuel's character. Where is he now? Why didn't he meet me at the station? David's expression grew somber. Because Samuel Hartwell died in that fire 3 weeks ago. He was trying to save his prize stallion when a burning beam collapsed. I couldn't reach him in time. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. I couldn't see to help him. I could only listen to. He couldn't finish the sentence. The finality of it hit Margaret like a landslide. Samuel was dead. The man who had promised to love her despite her scars, who had offered her a home and partnership in this mountain valley, was gone before she ever had the chance to meet him. She sank onto a fallen log near the forge, overwhelmed by grief for a man she had never seen but had grown to love through his letters. I should have written to you immediately, David continued, his voice rough with guilt. Should have told you not to come, but I couldn't bear to. I kept thinking maybe I could rebuild the forge, try to continue what Samuel had started, keep his promises somehow. Margaret looked up at him through her tears, seeing clearly for the first time the weight of loss and responsibility he carried. You've been trying to rebuild his life, along with his forge. Something like that. David moved to the fire and began banking the coals for the night, his movements automatic and precise. Seemed like the least I could do for the man who pulled me back from the edge of my own grave. But I'm not Samuel Hartwell. I can't offer you the life he promised, the partnership he envisioned. The practical reality of her situation began to settle over Margaret like the gathering mountain darkness. She was stranded hundreds of miles from Boston with limited funds, no prospects, and nowhere to go. Samuel's death had severed her last thread of hope for building a meaningful life. Yet something in David Morrison's voice, some quality she recognized from the letters she had treasured, made her hesitate before surrendering to despair. "What happened to your sight?" she asked quietly. David's hands stilled on the forged tools. "Mining accident 5 years ago. Explosion in a silver mine up near Leadville. Took my vision and killed my 2 brothers who were working the same claim." His voice carried old pain, worn smooth by years of repetition. "Spent a year drinking. Myself to death in Denver before I decided the mountains might finish the job more cleanly. But you learned to work metal despite being blind. Samuel taught me, said useful skills were the best medicine for a damaged soul." David's smile held sadness and gratitude in equal measure. He was right about that, as he was about most things. Working the forge gave me purpose again, something to focus on besides what I'd lost. Margaret studied this man who had been shaped by tragedy, yet had found the strength to help her correspondent express his feelings in elegant prose. There was something compelling about his calm acceptance of limitations, his determination to create beauty and utility despite his disability. Samuel's letters had revealed a deep philosophical nature that she now realized had been influenced by his friendship with this thoughtful, articulate blacksmith. "I have a proposal," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the boldness of the idea forming in her mind. "You need help rebuilding what the fire destroyed. I need a place to start over, somewhere I won't be judged by appearances alone. Perhaps we could work together, not as Samuel envisioned, but as partners in creating something new from the ashes." David turned toward her voice, his sightless eyes reflecting the dying firelight. "You don't know what you're suggesting. This is hard country, especially for someone alone. The winters are brutal, the nearest neighbor is 10 miles away, and I'm not exactly equipped to provide protection or even basic companionship for a refined woman from Boston." "I'm not as refined as you might think," Margaret replied with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I've been working as a seamstress since the fire, living in a tenement boarding house, saving every penny for the chance to start fresh. I can cook, clean, tend a garden, and I'm not afraid of hard work. As for companionship—" She paused, considering her words carefully. "Samuel's letters made me feel understood for the first time since my accident. If those feelings came from his heart through your words, then perhaps we might understand each other better than you, I think." David was quiet for a long moment, the only sounds the gentle hiss of cooling metal and the whisper of wind through pine branches. When he spoke, his voice held a note of wonder. "You would stay here? In the wilderness? With a blind man you've known for less than an hour?" "Where else would I go?" Margaret asked simply. "Back to Boston, where people cross the street to avoid looking at my face. To some other city where I'd be just another scarred spinster trying to survive on seamstress wages. At least here, in this beautiful country, I might build something meaningful. And you—" She hesitated, then forged ahead. "You saw me clearly through Samuel's eyes before you ever knew what I looked like. That's more true sight than most people possess." The profound truth of her observation settled between them, like a bridge spanning the chasm of their individual loneliness. David Morrison, who had lost his physical vision but retained the ability to perceive character and worth, and Margaret Sinclair, whose scarred face hid a spirit unbroken by adversity, recognized in each other the possibility of partnership based on understanding rather than conventional attraction. "It wouldn't be easy," David warned. "Building a life from nothing, surviving mountain winters, establishing a business in country that doesn't forgive mistakes." "Nothing worthwhile ever is," Margaret replied, thinking of the long journey that had brought her to this moment, this clearing, this man who had already seen her more clearly than her own mirror ever had. "But I'd rather fail attempting something meaningful than succeed at merely surviving." As full darkness settled over the mountain valley, David Morrison and Margaret Sinclair began to discuss the practical details of an impossible partnership, two broken people finding in each other's company the first genuine hope either had known in years. The forge fire died to glowing embers, but something else kindled in the mountain darkness, a warmth that had nothing to do with burning coal, and everything to do with the recognition that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the deepest devastation. The first light of dawn found Margaret and David already working in the clearing, their breath visible in the crisp mountain air as they surveyed the tasks ahead. Margaret had spent the night in David's simple lean-to shelter, separated by a canvas partition that preserved propriety while acknowledging the practical necessities of their situation. She had slept better than she had in months, lulled by the sound of the creek and the profound silence that only true wilderness could provide. "The foundation stones from Samuel's forge are still sound," David explained, running his hands expertly over the scattered remains. "We can salvage most of the ironwork too, once we sort through the debris. The real challenge will be constructing a proper shelter before the first snow." Margaret knelt beside him, her scarred fingers tracing the outline of what had once been the forge's base. "How much time do we have?" 6 weeks, maybe 8 if we're lucky with the weather." David's voice carried no anxiety despite the enormous scope of work ahead. "Samuel always said that mountain living teaches you to focus on what's possible rather than what's overwhelming. We'll start with the essentials and build from there." Their first joint project was establishing a proper workspace where they could sort salvageable materials from true debris. Margaret proved surprisingly strong despite her delicate appearance, hauling stones and timber with determined efficiency. Her scarred hands, already calloused from seamstress work, adapted quickly to rougher labor. David's blindness, which might have seemed like an insurmountable obstacle to rebuilding, actually proved advantageous in many tasks. His heightened senses of touch and hearing allowed him to detect structural weaknesses in timber that sighted eyes might miss, while his spatial memory enabled him to work efficiently in familiar areas. "You move through this forest like you can see every tree," Margaret observed, as David navigated confidently between closely spaced pines, carrying a load of salvaged iron. "In a way, I can," he replied, setting down his burden near their sorting area. "Sound bounces differently off bark than off rock. Pine needles underfoot feel different from fallen leaves. After 5 years, this mountain has become as familiar as a room in a house." He paused, tilting his head toward her voice. "The real trick isn't learning to move without sight. It's learning to trust other senses you've been ignoring your whole life." The parallel to her own situation wasn't lost on Margaret. She had spent 2 years learning to navigate a world that judged her by appearance, developing instincts about people's reactions before they spoke, reading character in voices rather than faces. "I suppose we've both learned to see what matters most." Their working rhythm developed naturally over the following days. David's expertise in metalworking complemented Margaret's practical skills in organization and planning. She proved adept at estimating materials needed for various construction phases, while he provided technical knowledge about forge operation and blacksmithing requirements. More importantly, they discovered an easy compatibility in their approaches to problem-solving. When they encountered a massive fallen tree blocking access to a stand of suitable timber, Margaret initially suggested finding an alternate route. David proposed a different solution entirely. "This tree fell recently," he said, running his hands along the trunk. "The wood is still green, perfect for construction if we can section it properly." He retrieved his tools and began examining the grain structure by touch. "Samuel taught me that obstacles often contain their own solutions. We just need to look at them differently." Working together, they spent 3 days converting the blocking tree into useful lumber. Margaret learned to read wood grain through her fingertips, following David's patient instruction. He learned to appreciate her systematic approach to organizing, their growing stockpile of materials. The physical labor was demanding, but Margaret found it profoundly satisfying in ways her sedentary seamstress work had never been. "I feel like I'm building something that matters," she confided one evening as they shared a simple meal beside their campfire. "In Boston, I spent my days mending other people's clothes, fixing things that would just wear out again. Here, every beam we cut, every stone we place, it's creating something permanent." David nodded, understanding implicit in his expression. "Samuel used to say that real satisfaction comes from making something that will outlast you. Not just objects, but improvements to the world itself." Their partnership deepened beyond mere labor as they shared evening conversations around the fire. Margaret learned that David had been a mine engineer before his accident, educated at the Colorado School of Mines with dreams of revolutionizing extraction techniques. His blindness had ended those ambitions, but his analytical mind found new applications in blacksmithing and construction. "I thought my useful life was over," he admitted one night, staring into flames he couldn't see but could feel warming his face. "The explosion took more than my sight. It took my identity, my purpose, everything I thought defined my worth as a man." Margaret understood that particular devastation. "The fire changed more than my face. It changed how the world saw me, how I saw myself. I thought beauty was shallow vanity until I lost it and discovered how much of my value I'd tied to appearance. Yet here you are, building a new life in wilderness country most people would find impossibly challenging." David's voice carried genuine admiration. "That takes a kind of courage that has nothing to do with how you look." The simple validation meant more to Margaret than elaborate compliments ever had. David's blindness freed him from the visual prejudices that had made her feel invisible in Boston society. He responded to her intelligence, her humor, her determination, seeing her clearly in ways that sighted people never had. Their construction progress accelerated as they developed efficient working methods. David's forge skills proved invaluable for creating specialized tools and hardware they couldn't purchase in town. Margaret's sewing expertise translated surprisingly well to tasks like chinking log walls and fabricating canvas coverings. They worked from dawn to dusk, driven by the approaching winter deadline, but sustained by the deep satisfaction of collaborative creation. The first major milestone came when they completed the foundation for their new forge. Built from stones, salvaged from Samuel's original structure, but designed with improvements David had envisioned, it represented both continuity with the past and hope for the future. Margaret had suggested modifications that would make the workspace more efficient, while David incorporated safety features learned from painful experience. "Samuel would approve," David said as they surveyed their completed work. "He always believed in building better, not just rebuilding the same." Margaret felt a profound connection to the man she had never met, but whose dreams they were now fulfilling in unexpected ways. "I wish I could have known him." "You did know him," David replied gently. "Through those letters, through the hopes he shared, through the kindness he showed a broken stranger who stumbled onto his property. Samuel's best qualities live on in what we're building here." Their cabin construction began with David teaching Margaret the fundamentals of log selection and preparation. She learned to identify suitable trees, fell them safely, and prepare the logs for construction. Her initial attempts were clumsy, but David's patient instruction and her own determination led to steady improvement. "The secret is working with the wood's natural characteristics rather than fighting them," he explained as they notched logs for the cabin walls. "Every tree grew responding to wind, sun, and weather. If you understand those patterns, you can predict how the wood will behave." Margaret found herself applying this philosophy beyond construction work. Her scarred face had resulted from circumstances beyond her control, but she could choose how to respond to people's reactions. Rather than hiding behind veils and shadows, she began holding her head high, meeting curious glances with calm dignity. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but David noticed her growing confidence. "You carry yourself differently now," he observed one morning as they prepared for another day of building. "I feel different," Margaret admitted. "Stronger, somehow more certain of my own worth." "Physical labor has a way of proving to yourself what you're capable of," David agreed. "But I think it's more than that. You're discovering who you really are when external judgments fall away." Their evenings developed a comfortable ritual of sharing meals, discussing the next day's work, and gradually revealing more about their past lives. Margaret learned that David had been engaged before his accident to a Denver socialite named Catherine Williams, who had ended their relationship after his injury, unable to envision a future with a disabled man. "I thought I loved her," David reflected, "but I realize now that what I loved was how her beauty reflected on my own status. Losing my sight forced me to confront the shallowness of that attraction." Margaret shared her own romantic disappointments. The handful of suitors who had shown interest before her accident, but vanished afterward. "I began to believe that love was reserved for the physically perfect, that scarred women were destined for loneliness. Yet here we are," David said simply, "two imperfect people building something beautiful together." The observation hung between them, not quite an admission of romantic feeling, but an acknowledgement of their deepening connection. They were partners in reconstruction, but increasingly, Margaret sensed the possibility of something more profound growing from their shared purpose. Their cabin walls rose steadily through September, each course of logs bringing them closer to winter-ready shelter. Margaret's construction skills improved dramatically under David's tutelage, while she contributed practical insights about interior layout and functionality. They debated window placement, discussed chimney design, and planned storage solutions. With the intensity of architects designing a cathedral. "Most people build houses," David observed as they installed the final wall logs. "We're building a home." The distinction resonated deeply with Margaret. This structure represented more than shelter. It embodied their shared vision of independence, self-sufficiency, and mutual support. Every log they placed was an act of faith in their partnership and their future in this mountain valley. October brought the first serious test of their collaboration, when an early snowstorm caught them with the cabin walls complete, but the roof still unfinished. Working frantically in driving snow, they managed to install enough temporary covering to protect their interior from the worst of the weather. Huddled together in the partially completed structure while wind howled outside, Margaret felt a profound sense of accomplishment. "We did it," she whispered, watching snowflakes swirl through gaps in their makeshift roof. "We actually built something that's keeping us alive." David's hand found hers in the darkness, his calloused fingers intertwining with her work roughened. "We're not just surviving, Margaret. We're proving that broken people can create something whole." The simple contact sent warmth through Margaret that had nothing to do with their small fire. David's touch carried no pity for her scars, no awkwardness about her appearance. His fingers traced the damaged skin on her hand with the same gentle appreciation he showed when examining fine metalwork. "I can't see your scars," he said quietly, "but I can feel the strength in these hands, the determination that carried you through pain most people never endure. That's infinitely more beautiful than unblemished skin." Margaret felt tears forming, not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of being truly seen and valued for who she had become, rather than what she had lost. "I thought beauty was something you were born with or without. I'm learning it's something you can build, one choice at a time." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of voices calling through the storm. Someone was approaching their cabin in dangerous weather, seeking help or shelter. David immediately moved toward the door, his protective instincts overriding caution. "Hello, the cabin." The voice belonged to a young man, probably no more than 18, accompanied by what sounded like a woman and possibly children. "We're lost in the storm. Please, we need help." Margaret and David exchanged glances, their peaceful evening suddenly transformed into a crisis requiring immediate action. Without hesitation, they opened their door to strangers in need, embodying the mountain code that survival often depended on mutual aid. The family who stumbled into their cabin consisted of Tom and Sarah Mitchell, homesteaders in their 20s, along with their 2 small children. They had been traveling to their own property when the storm struck with unexpected ferocity, disorienting them in the whiteout conditions. "We've been walking in circles for hours," Sarah Mitchell explained, her voice shaking with cold and exhaustion. "The children are so cold, and we couldn't find any landmarks in the snow." Margaret immediately took charge of caring for the family, while David secured their horses and gathered additional firewood. She wrapped the children in warm blankets, prepared hot soup from their supplies, and created comfortable sleeping arrangements in their unfinished cabin. The crisis brought out leadership qualities she hadn't known she possessed. "You're angels," Tom Mitchell said as warmth and food restored his family's strength. "We could have died out there if you hadn't taken us in." "Mountain people help each other," David replied simply. "That's how we all survive up here." The storm continued for 2 days, during which their unexpected guests became temporary family members. Margaret and Sarah bonded over the challenges of frontier life, while David and Tom collaborated on completing the cabin's roof system. The children, initially shy about Margaret's scars, quickly warmed to her gentle nature and storytelling abilities. "You're natural teachers," Sarah observed, as Margaret helped her daughter with basic arithmetic using carved wooden blocks. "These children have learned more in 2 days than they did in months of irregular schooling." The comment planted seeds of possibility in Margaret's mind. Perhaps their isolated homestead could serve a larger purpose than just providing for themselves. Mountain communities desperately needed educated people willing to share knowledge and skills. When the storm finally cleared, the Mitchell family prepared to continue their journey with detailed directions from David and supplies from Margaret's carefully managed stores. Their gratitude was profound and genuine, establishing the kind of neighborly connection that made frontier life survivable. "You'll always have friends at the Mitchell place," Tom declared as they loaded their wagon. "Anything you need, any help we can provide, you just ask." After their guests departed, Margaret and David returned to their construction work with renewed energy and a deeper understanding of their place in the mountain community. They were no longer just 2 isolated individuals rebuilding from personal disasters. They were becoming contributing members of a network of mutual support that made civilization possible in challenging country. "This feels like the beginning of something larger," Margaret said as they completed their roof installation in crisp autumn sunshine. "Not just a home for us, but a place where people can find help when they need it." David nodded, understanding her vision immediately. Samuel always said the best way to heal from tragedy was to prevent others from suffering the same pain. Maybe that's our real purpose here. As October progressed toward November, their cabin transformed from shelter into home. Margaret's sewing skills created comfortable furnishings from available materials, while David's metalworking provided functional hardware and tools. They established efficient systems for cooking, cleaning, and managing their growing stockpile of winter supplies. More importantly, they developed the easy intimacy of true partners, people who understood each other's strengths and compensated naturally for each other's limitations. Margaret learned to describe visual details in ways that helped David navigate new situations, while he taught her to rely on non-visual senses for information she had always gathered through sight. Their relationship remained respectfully platonic, but Margaret increasingly sensed the possibility of deeper connection. David's gentle strength and unwavering support had rebuilt her confidence in ways she hadn't thought possible. His blindness, initially seeming like an obstacle to romantic attachment, actually created opportunities for emotional intimacy uncomplicated by physical appearance concerns. As the first hard freeze announced winter's approach, Margaret and David completed their essential preparations with time to spare. Their cabin stood snug and weatherproof, their forge operated efficiently, and their food stores would see them through the coldest months. They had not merely survived the transition. From their former lives, they had created something beautiful from the ashes of their individual disasters. Standing together on their completed porch, watching the sun set over snow-dusted peaks, Margaret felt a profound sense of accomplishment mixed with anticipation for whatever challenges lay ahead. She had traveled west, seeking a new beginning, with a stranger who promised acceptance despite her scars. Instead, she had found something far more valuable, a true partner who saw her clearly in ways that had nothing to do with physical appearance, and the strength to build a meaningful life based on mutual respect and shared purpose. The first true test of their mountain partnership came not from winter's expected hardships, but from an unexpected visitor who arrived on a bitter November morning when snow lay 3 feet deep around their cabin. Margaret was teaching David a new technique for preparing leather when they heard the labored breathing of horses struggling through the drifts. Through their window, she could see a well-dressed man on horseback, accompanied by 2 pack animals and what appeared to be a surveyor's equipment. "Someone's coming," Margaret announced, automatically adjusting her position so the unmarked side of her face would be visible first. Old habits died hard, even in their mountain sanctuary, where such precautions seemed unnecessary. David set down his work and moved toward the door, with the confident stride that never failed to amaze. Margaret, strange time of year for visitors, must be important business to risk the mountain roads in this weather. The stranger who dismounted at their porch was perhaps 45 years old, with the soft build and pale complexion of a man more accustomed to offices than outdoor labor. His expensive wool coat and fine leather boots marked him as someone of considerable means, though his obvious discomfort with the cold suggested he was far from his usual environment. "Good morning," he called, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I'm looking for David Morrison. I'm told he might be found at this location." Margaret felt David tense beside her, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "I'm Morrison," he replied evenly. "What brings you up the mountain in winter weather?" The stranger studied David with sharp, calculating eyes that lingered uncomfortably on his blindness. "Franklin Webb, attorney from Denver. I represent the Consolidated Mining Corporation. We need to discuss some important matters regarding this property and your situation here." Margaret's protective instincts immediately sharpened. Something in Webb's tone suggested this was not a social call or routine business matter. The way he emphasized David's situation carried implications that made her deeply uneasy. "Perhaps you'd better come inside," David said, though Margaret detected reluctance in his voice. "The cold isn't good for extended conversation." Webb accepted the invitation, though his gaze swept their modest cabin interior with barely concealed disdain. Margaret busied herself preparing coffee, using the activity to observe their visitor while remaining unobtrusive. The lawyer's attention focused entirely on David, as if she were merely household help unworthy of acknowledgement. "I'll come straight to the point, Morrison. Webb began, settling into the chair David indicated. Consolidated Mining has acquired mineral rights to this entire valley through purchase and federal land grants. We're prepared to offer you substantial compensation for vacating these premises within 30 days. David's expression remained impassive, but Margaret saw his hands clench slightly. This property belongs to Samuel Hartwell's estate. I'm here with proper permission as caretaker and business partner. Webb produced a leather portfolio and extracted several official-looking documents. Samuel Hartwell's claim was never properly filed with the Territorial Land Office. According to federal records, this property reverted to public domain upon his death. Consolidated has since acquired legitimate title through proper channels. Margaret set the coffee cups on their table with deliberate care, fighting the urge to speak out of turn. She had learned enough about frontier law during her correspondence with Samuel to know that disputed land claims were common and often decided by whoever had the better legal representation and political connections. "You're saying Samuel's homestead claim was invalid?" David asked quietly. "Invalid is a strong word," Webb replied with calculated diplomacy. "Let's say it was. Incomplete, missing certain required documentation and fees. These oversights happen frequently with uneducated settlers who don't understand proper procedures." The insult to Samuel's memory sparked Margaret's anger, but David's subtle gesture warned her to remain silent. She recognized his strategy of gathering information before revealing his own hand. And what exactly does Consolidated Mining want with this particular valley? David inquired, his tone remaining conversational despite the gravity of the situation. Webb's smile held no warmth. "Geological surveys indicate significant mineral deposits throughout this region. Copper, possibly silver, maybe even gold. The company is prepared to invest heavily in extraction operations, but that requires clear title to the land and removal of any complications." Margaret understood immediately that David's presence represented one of those complications. A blind homesteader might be viewed as easily displaced, especially if he lacked proper legal documentation for his residence. "I assume you have documentation proving Consolidated's claim," David said, extending his hand toward the papers Webb had displayed. "Of course." Webb handed over the documents with obvious satisfaction. "Everything is completely legal and properly recorded." David's fingers moved across the papers with practiced efficiency, reading the raised seals and embossed text through touch. Margaret had learned that his blindness had developed his tactile abilities to remarkable levels, enabling him to detect details that might escape visual examination. "These documents appear to be in order," David admitted after several minutes of careful examination. "Though I notice they're dated quite recently. Consolidated moved very quickly after Samuel's death." Webb's expression grew cooler. "The company maintains extensive surveys of mineral-rich regions. When opportunities arise, we act decisively to protect our investors' interests." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain weather. The timing seemed suspiciously convenient, as if someone had been waiting for Samuel's death to implement pre-existing plans. She wondered if the fire that had killed Samuel and destroyed his property might not have been as accidental as everyone assumed. 30 days seems like a short timeline for relocating an established operation, David observed, especially during winter conditions. "Consolidated is prepared to be generous with compensation," Webb replied, producing another document. "This offer should more than cover your expenses for relocating to more suitable accommodations." Margaret caught a glimpse of the figure written on the paper and felt her breath catch. The amount was substantial, enough to purchase property elsewhere and establish a new forge operation. For someone in David's position, it might seem like a generous windfall. David studied the offer through his fingertips. his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "This is indeed a considerable sum. May I have time to consider your proposal?" "Certainly," Webb agreed, though his tone suggested the question was merely a formality. "I'll return in 1 week for your answer. I trust that will provide adequate time for reflection." After Webb departed, struggling back down the mountain through deepening snow, Margaret and David sat in troubled silence around their fire. The lawyer's visit had shattered the peaceful security they had built together, introducing threats they were ill-equipped to combat through physical labor or determination alone. "He expects you to take the money and disappear," Margaret said finally, voicing the conclusion they had both reached. "Probably sees a blind man as an easy target," David agreed grimly. "Someone who can't fight back effectively against corporate interests." Margaret studied his profile in the firelight, seeing the tension he was trying to conceal. "But you're not going to abandon everything we've built here. Are we built here?" David turned toward her voice, his sightless eyes reflecting the flames. "This partnership of ours, this life we're creating, is it strong enough to survive this kind of pressure?" The question forced Margaret to confront feelings she had been developing but hadn't fully acknowledged. Their collaboration had evolved beyond mere survival into something approaching genuine partnership, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The thought of losing that connection, of watching David disappear with Webb's money, filled her with unexpected anguish. "I won't abandon you," she said quietly. "Whatever we face together." David's expression softened, and she saw relief replace the careful neutrality he had maintained during Webb's visit. "Even if it means fighting a corporation with unlimited resources and legal advantages?" "Especially then." Margaret's voice strengthened with conviction. "Samuel died protecting what he loved. We owe it to his memory to protect what we've built on his foundation." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Multiple riders moving rapidly through the snow despite the deteriorating weather conditions. Margaret peered through their window and counted at least 6 men, all armed, and moving with the purposeful coordination of an organized group. "More visitors," she announced, though something in their approach suggested this would not be a polite social call. David joined her at the window, tilting his head to analyze the sounds of their approach. Too many horses for casual travelers. They're moving like men with specific business. The riders reined in before their cabin, and Margaret recognized the leader as Tom Mitchell, the homesteader they had helped during the October storm. His presence brought immediate relief, though the grim expressions of his companions suggested serious trouble. "David! Margaret!" Tom called from his saddle. "We need to talk. It's about Webb and his mining company." They invited the group. Inside, though their small cabin became crowded with 6 additional people, Margaret quickly prepared coffee for everyone, while David arranged seating around their table. The other men introduced themselves as neighboring homesteaders and ranchers, all facing similar pressure from consolidated mining. "Webb visited every property in the valley," explained Jake Patterson, a rancher whose spread lay 5 miles downstream. "Same story everywhere. Questionable land titles, generous buyout offers, 30-day deadlines. He's trying to clear the entire region for mining operations." Margaret felt her anger building as she learned the scope of Consolidated's campaign. Families who had invested years building homes and livelihoods were being systematically displaced through legal manipulation and economic pressure. "The worst part is, most of the claims probably are technically invalid," admitted Ben Rogers, whose sawmill operation employed a dozen local men. "Samuel wasn't the only one who didn't understand all the federal requirements. Webb knows that, and he's using it against us." David leaned forward intently. "What kind of legal defenses do we have?" "Individually? Not much," Tom Mitchell replied. "But together we might have options. There's precedent for challenging corporate land grabs when they displace established communities. We just need proper legal representation. Margaret saw immediately where the conversation was heading. You want to band together and fight consolidated in court. It's our only chance, Jake Patterson said. Webb's counting on picking us off one by one, convincing each family to take the money and leave quietly. If we present a united front, we might be able to delay the process long enough to find legal weaknesses in their claims. The plan was ambitious but fraught with risks. Legal battles against well-funded corporations rarely favored small homesteaders, especially when territorial courts often showed favoritism toward business interests that brought investment capital to the region. What about the mineral rights Webb mentioned? David asked. If there really are valuable deposits here, Consolidated has powerful incentives to push this through quickly. Ben Rogers snorted derisively. I've been cutting timber in these mountains for 8 years. If there were major mineral deposits here, someone would have found them by now. My guess is Consolidated is speculating, hoping to find something valuable after they control the land. Margaret considered this possibility, remembering Webb's confident assertions about copper and silver deposits. Or they could be deliberately exaggerating the mineral potential to justify their aggressive tactics. Either way, Tom Mitchell said, we need to make a decision quickly. Webb will be back next week expecting answers from all of us. If we're going to fight this together, we need to organize immediately. The discussion continued late into the evening as the group planned their collective response to Consolidated's pressure. They would pool resources to hire a Denver attorney specializing in land disputes, coordinate their legal defense to prevent individual families from being isolated and coerced, and document every aspect of their legitimate claims to strengthen their position in court. Margaret found herself taking an active role in the planning, contributing ideas about organization and communication that the men readily accepted. Her education and analytical thinking proved valuable assets in developing strategy, while her growing reputation as a community helper gave her voice additional credibility. Margaret's right about keeping detailed records, Jake Patterson agreed, after she suggested documenting all interactions with Webb and Consolidated representatives. Corporate lawyers depend on homesteaders being too disorganized to mount effective opposition. As the meeting concluded and their visitors prepared to depart, David pulled Tom Mitchell aside for a private conversation. Margaret couldn't hear their words, but she saw Tom's expression grow serious as David spoke quietly but intently. "What did you tell him?" Margaret asked after the last rider had disappeared into the snowy darkness. David moved closer to the fire, his expression troubled. "I warned him that we might be dealing with more than legal manipulation. The timing of Samuel's death, the speed with which Consolidated acquired their claims, Webb's confidence about displacing established homesteaders, it all suggests they've been planning this operation for months." Margaret felt cold dread settling in her stomach. "You think Samuel's death wasn't accidental?" "I think Samuel died very conveniently for people who wanted his property," David replied carefully. "And I think we need to be extremely careful about how we proceed from here." The implications were staggering. If Consolidated was willing to use violence to acquire land, their small community faced dangers far beyond legal harassment. Margaret thought about Samuel's brave decision to save his horse from the burning stable, wondering if someone had deliberately created the emergency that led to his death. "We can't let them intimidate us into abandoning everything we've built," she said with fierce determination. "Samuel died protecting this place. We owe it to him and to ourselves to continue that fight." David reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become natural between them. "Are you sure you understand what we're committing to? This won't be just a legal battle. We're challenging people who apparently have no moral limits on their methods." Margaret thought about her journey from Boston, the courage it had taken to travel across the country, seeking a new life with a stranger, the strength she had discovered while rebuilding from devastating loss. "I've already survived the worst. Thing I thought could happen to me. I'm not about to let corporate greed destroy the best thing that's come from that survival." Their resolve was tested 3 days later when they discovered that someone had sabotaged their forge during the night. The bellows system had been deliberately damaged. Tools had been scattered and some stolen, and their carefully organized metalwork had been destroyed. The message was clear: resistance would bring escalating consequences. "Professional work," David observed grimly as he assessed the damage through touch. Whoever did this knew exactly how to disable a forge operation most effectively. Margaret surveyed the destruction with growing anger rather than intimidation. "Then we rebuild it better than before, and we make sure the whole community knows what Consolidated is willing to do to people who won't surrender." Their determination to resist attracted unexpected support from throughout the region. Word of the forge sabotage spread quickly through the mountain settlements, generating outrage among families who had thought themselves safe from corporate intimidation. Margaret and David found themselves at the center of a growing movement that extended far beyond their immediate valley. "You've become symbols," explained Maria Santos, a Mexican-American rancher whose family had been facing similar pressure from mining interests. "People see a blind man and a scarred woman, refusing to be bullied by wealthy corporations, and it gives them courage to stand up for themselves." Margaret had never thought of herself as a symbol of anything, but she recognized the truth in Maria's observation. Their visible disabilities, which society often viewed as weaknesses, had actually become sources of strength and inspiration for others facing seemingly impossible odds. "The real power comes from working together," David replied to Maria's comment. "Isolated individuals can be defeated easily. Communities united around common purpose are much harder to destroy." As December deepened and Webb's return approached, their cabin became an informal headquarters for coordinating resistance throughout the region. Margaret's organizational skills proved invaluable in managing communication between scattered homesteads, while David's analytical mind helped develop legal strategies their hired attorney could pursue in territorial court. The work was exhausting and sometimes overwhelming, but Margaret felt more alive and purposeful than she had since before her accident. Rather than hiding from the world because of her scars, she was helping lead a fight that could determine the future of mountain communities. "Throughout Colorado Territory, I used to think my face defined my limitations," she confided to David one evening as they reviewed legal documents by lamplight. "Now I'm discovering that real limitations exist only in our willingness to accept defeat." David looked up from the papers he was reading through touch, his expression reflecting pride and affection that needed no words to communicate. "Samuel would be amazed at what's grown from the seeds he planted. Not just our forge and cabin, but this entire movement toward justice and community solidarity." Their peaceful moment was shattered by urgent knocking at their door. Tom Mitchell stood on their porch, his face grave with news that would test every principle they had committed to defending. "Webb's back early," he announced without preamble. "And he's not alone. There's a federal marshal with him, plus a dozen men who definitely aren't lawyers. They're setting up camp at the old mining camp, and word is they plan to start serving eviction notices tomorrow morning." Margaret felt her heart racing as she processed this escalation. "How long do we have?" "Maybe 12 hours, Tom replied grimly. "They'll hit the most isolated properties first, trying to pick off families who can't get help quickly enough. After that—" He shrugged helplessly. David stood slowly, his expression resolving into the calm determination Margaret had learned to recognize as his preparation for difficult action. "Then we make sure no family faces them alone. It's time to find out what our community is really made of. Dawn broke cold and clear over the mountain valley as Margaret and David prepared for what might be their final stand against Consolidated Mining's aggressive tactics. Their cabin had become a nerve center throughout the night, with riders arriving hourly to report Webb's movements and coordinate the community's defensive strategy. Margaret had transformed from a scarred refugee seeking shelter into the logistical backbone of a resistance movement that now encompassed over 40 families across 3 counties. "The Patterson Ranch is first on their list," announced Sarah. Mitchell, who had ridden through dangerous pre-dawn conditions to bring intelligence gathered by her husband's scouting party. "Webb's men are loading wagons with what looks like eviction equipment. They plan to physically remove families who refuse to leave voluntarily." Margaret studied the crude map they had drawn on her kitchen table, marking each homestead's location and identifying defensive advantages. Her seamstress training had developed skills in pattern recognition and spatial planning that proved invaluable in military-style coordination. If they take the Patterson place, they control the main road into the valley. Every other family becomes isolated and vulnerable. David stood at their window, his heightened hearing tracking sounds that sighted observers might miss. Multiple horses moving upslope, probably scouts checking approaches to each property. Webb's operating like a military commander, not a lawyer. The transformation of their peaceful valley into a battlefield filled Margaret with both fear and fierce determination. She thought of Samuel Hartwell, who had died protecting what he loved, and knew that retreat was not an option. Too many families had invested too much hope in their collective resistance to abandon the fight when it became dangerous. "We need to get to the Patterson Ranch before Webb's men arrive," she declared, already moving toward their weapons and emergency supplies. "If we can organize effective resistance at the first confrontation, it sends a message to every other family that they're not alone." David's expression reflected both admiration and concern for her boldness. "Margaret, this could turn violent very quickly. Webb's brought professional enforcers, not just legal representatives. You don't have to expose yourself to that kind of danger." "Yes, I do." Margaret's voice carried absolute conviction as she loaded her late father's hunting rifle with steady hands. "I came to this mountain seeking a place where I could build something meaningful despite my scars. What we've created here, this community, this partnership, this proof that broken people can become strong together, it's worth fighting for." They departed their cabin as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, riding hard through snow-covered forest toward the Patterson Ranch 5 miles downstream. Margaret had become an accomplished horsewoman during her months in the mountains, learning to read terrain and weather conditions with skills that complemented David's enhanced spatial awareness. Together, they moved through the wilderness with confidence that would have been impossible for either alone. The sight that greeted them at the Patterson Ranch confirmed their worst fears about Consolidated's tactics. Webb had arrived with a federal marshal, a dozen armed men who looked more like hired gunfighters than legal representatives, and equipment clearly designed for forcible property seizure. Jake Patterson stood on his porch with his wife and 3 children, outnumbered but refusing to surrender the home they had built through 5 years of backbreaking labor. "You have no legal right to remove us from our own property," Patterson was saying as Margaret and David approached through the tree line. "Our attorney in Denver has filed appeals challenging your land claims." Webb's reply carried the cold arrogance of a man who believed superior resources guaranteed victory. "Appeals can take years to resolve, Patterson. Meanwhile, Consolidated has legitimate federal authority to develop this land for mineral extraction. You can leave voluntarily with compensation or be removed by force. The choice is yours. Margaret felt her anger crystallizing into focused determination as she witnessed this calculated intimidation of a family whose only crime was building a successful homestead in country that corporations now coveted. She guided her horse into the open, making her presence known before the confrontation could escalate beyond words. "Mr. Webb," she called, her voice carrying clearly across the ranch yard. "How disappointing to see you've brought armed men to intimidate families with children. Is this how Consolidated Mining conducts legitimate business?" Webb's expression showed surprise and irritation at her arrival. "Miss Sinclair, this doesn't concern you. I suggest you return to your own property before this situation becomes unpleasant." "Everything that happens in this valley concerns me," Margaret replied, dismounting with deliberate confidence. "We're neighbors here, people who support each other through difficulties. You might find that harder to overcome than you anticipated." David joined her, his imposing physical presence and calm demeanor adding weight to their intervention. Despite his blindness, he moved with such assured purpose that Webb's hired men instinctively recognized a formidable opponent. "Federal marshals are sworn to protect citizens' rights, not help corporations steal property," he observed, addressing the lawman directly. Marshal Timothy Hawkins, a grizzled veteran who looked uncomfortable with his current assignment, shifted uneasily in his saddle. "I have court orders authorizing property seizure in cases of invalid land claims. These homesteaders' titles are legally questionable." "Questionable according to whom?" Margaret challenged. "The same corporate lawyers who stand to profit from declaring legitimate homesteads invalid? That hardly seems like impartial legal judgment." Her words struck home, and she saw doubt flicker across the marshal's weathered features. Hawkins was clearly a man who took his oath seriously, struggling with orders that seemed designed to benefit private interests rather than serve justice. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with Webb growing increasingly agitated at the delay in his carefully planned operation. His hired men looked ready for violence, hands resting on weapon grips as they awaited orders to escalate the confrontation. Then the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of Tom Mitchell, leading a group of 8 mounted homesteaders, all armed and moving with grim purpose. Margaret felt a surge of pride as she recognized the faces of families they had helped organize over the past weeks, people who had chosen solidarity over individual safety. "Seems like you've got quite a gathering here, Webb," Tom called as his group deployed in a loose semicircle around the corporate forces. "Funny how word travels fast when neighbors look out for each other." Webb's confident demeanor began cracking under the pressure of facing organized resistance rather than isolated families. "This is illegal assembly designed to obstruct federal law enforcement. I'll have you all arrested for conspiracy. Conspiracy to protect our homes and families." Maria Santos spoke up from her position flanking Tom's group. "I think most judges would call that civic duty, not criminal activity." Margaret seized the moment to address Marshal Hawkins directly, appealing to whatever sense of justice had originally drawn him to law enforcement. "Marshal, take a good look at what's happening here. Corporate representatives using armed intimidation against families with children. Federal authority being manipulated to serve private profit. Honest citizens being labeled criminals for defending their legal rights. Is this really the law you swore to uphold?" Hawkins studied the scene with growing discomfort, clearly recognizing that his orders had placed him in a morally indefensible position. "Mr. Webb, perhaps we should postpone this operation until your legal claims can be reviewed more thoroughly by territorial courts." This is Webb's facade of civilized authority finally shattered completely. "I don't care about your personal feelings, Marshal. You have federal orders to clear this property, and I expect you to follow them, regardless of local opinion." "Actually," came a new voice from the forest edge, "those federal orders have..." been suspended pending investigation of fraudulent documentation. Margaret turned to see a tall man in the expensive suit riding toward them, accompanied by two assistants carrying official-looking documents. The newcomer possessed the confident bearing of someone accustomed to wielding significant authority, and his arrival clearly shocked Webb into speechless surprise. "Thomas Brennan, Territorial Attorney General," the man announced as he dismounted near Marshal Hawkins. "I've received disturbing reports about irregular land seizures in this region, possibly involving forged federal documents and intimidation of legitimate homesteaders." Webb recovered his composure with visible effort. "Attorney General Brennan, this is highly irregular. Consolidated Mining has followed all proper legal procedures in acquiring mineral rights to this territory." "Has it?" Brennan's tone carried skeptical authority as he examined documents Webb reluctantly provided. "Because our investigation suggests that several key federal permits were issued based on fraudulent geological surveys and falsified impact assessments." Margaret felt hope surging through her as she realized that their legal appeals had reached sympathetic ears at the territorial level. Someone with real authority was finally challenging Consolidated's apparently legitimate but actually questionable claims. Furthermore, Brennan continued, reports of property sabotage and armed intimidation suggest that Consolidated has been using illegal methods to pressure homesteaders into surrendering valid claims. Such tactics violate both territorial and federal law. David stepped forward, his voice carrying quiet authority. Attorney General Brennan, we have documented evidence of the forged sabotage incident, witness statements about threats and intimidation, and records of suspicious circumstances surrounding Samuel Hartwell's death. This community has been systematically targeted for removal through methods that have nothing to do with legitimate legal process. Brennan's expression grew increasingly grim as David outlined their evidence of corporate malfeasance. Marshal Hawkins, I'm ordering an immediate suspension of all eviction proceedings pending complete investigation of these allegations. Any attempt to remove homesteaders or damage property will result in federal criminal charges. Webb's hired gunmen began looking uncomfortable as they realized their intimidation tactics had not only failed, but potentially exposed them to serious legal consequences. Several began moving toward their horses, clearly eager to distance themselves from what was rapidly becoming a legal disaster for their employer. This is outrageous interference with legitimate business operations, Webb protested, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Consolidated Mining will file federal complaints about territorial overreach and obstruction of interstate commerce. Consolidated is welcome to file whatever complaints they choose, Brennan replied coolly. Meanwhile, they'll operate within the law or face prosecution for conspiracy, fraud, and violation of homestead rights. Margaret watched Webb's authority collapse like a house of cards, his carefully planned operation reduced to legal chaos by the community's coordinated resistance and timely intervention from territorial authorities. The families who had seemed helpless against corporate power just hours earlier now stood vindicated, their courage in standing together validated by official recognition of their rights. As Webb and his demoralized forces retreated toward town, leaving the Patterson family secure on their own property, Margaret felt profound satisfaction in their collective achievement. They had proven that ordinary people could successfully resist corporate intimidation when they organized effectively and refused to be divided against each other. "Thank you," Jake Patterson said simply, shaking hands with each member of their impromptu defense force. "Without your support, my family would be homeless right now, and Consolidated would be one step closer to controlling this entire valley." Margaret looked around at the faces of their neighbors, homesteaders, ranchers, small business owners who had risked their own security to protect each other's rights, and felt overwhelming pride in what they had accomplished together. We protected each other, just like Samuel would have wanted. That's what real community means. As the group prepared to disperse, Attorney General Brennan approached Margaret and David with an unexpected proposition. Your organizational efforts and documentation of corporate abuses have been instrumental in exposing this conspiracy, he said. Would you consider serving as territorial liaisons for homestead protection? We need people with your skills and credibility to help other communities facing similar threats. Margaret exchanged glances with David, seeing her own surprise and growing excitement reflected in his expression. You're offering us official positions. I'm offering you the opportunity to expand what you've built here, Brennan clarified. This valley has become a model for effective community resistance to corporate land grabbing. Other regions need the same kind of leadership and organization you've demonstrated. David's thoughtful expression suggested he was already considering the implications. It would mean traveling throughout the territory, helping other communities organize their defenses against corporate pressure. It would also mean legitimizing the work we're already doing, Margaret added, recognizing the potential to transform their individual struggle into a broader movement for justice. Samuel died protecting this valley. Perhaps we can honor his memory by protecting others facing the same threats. Their conversation was interrupted by young Billy Patterson, Jake's 8-year-old son, who approached Margaret with shy determination. Miss Margaret, Pa says you and Mr. David saved our home. Can you teach me to be brave like you? Margaret knelt to the boy's eye level, her scarred face level with his curious gaze. Bravery isn't about not being scared, Billy. It's about doing what's right even when you are scared. And the most important thing to remember is that we're never really brave alone. We're brave together. The child's innocent acceptance of her appearance, his focus on her actions rather than her scars, reminded Margaret of how far she had traveled from the woman who had arrived in Colorado territory seeking nothing more than escape from Boston's cruel judgments. She had found not just acceptance, but purpose, not just survival, but leadership, not just a hiding place, but a platform for making meaningful change in the world. As evening approached and their neighbors departed for their own homes, Margaret and David rode slowly back through the forest toward their cabin. The mountain landscape, painted in winter sunset colors, looked exactly as it had that morning, but everything had fundamentally changed. They were no longer just survivors rebuilding from personal disasters. They were leaders of a successful movement that had proven ordinary people could triumph over corporate intimidation. Are you ready for what Brennan is offering? David asked as they navigated familiar trails through deepening twilight. Territorial liaison positions would mean leaving our comfortable cabin and forge, facing new challenges in unfamiliar places. Margaret considered the question as their horses picked careful paths through snow-covered rocks. I came to Colorado territory, running from who I thought I was supposed to be, seeking someone who could accept who I had become. I found something better, the chance to discover who I could choose to become. And who is that? David's voice carried gentle curiosity mixed with something deeper, a question that encompassed both her answer to Brennan's offer and the evolving nature of their partnership. Someone who helps other people find their own strength, Margaret replied, feeling the truth of it resonate through her entire being. Someone who proves that being broken doesn't mean being worthless, that scars can become sources of wisdom, that the most beautiful things grow from the most difficult ground. They rode the final mile to their cabin in comfortable silence, each contemplating the remarkable journey that had brought them from individual tragedy to collective triumph. The warm glow of lamplight in their windows promised the peaceful evening they had earned through courage and determination. Inside their snug home, surrounded by the tools and furnishings they had created together, Margaret and David finally addressed the question that had been building between them throughout their months of partnership. What they had built transcended mere survival or even successful business collaboration. It had become a foundation for something deeper and more permanent. "Margaret," David said quietly as they settled beside their fireplace, "I need you to know that what happened today, what we accomplished together, it proved something I've been hoping but not daring to believe." "What's that?" she asked, though her racing heart suggested she already knew. "That we're not just partners in rebuilding from tragedy. We're partners in creating something beautiful that neither of us could build alone." His sightless eyes found her face with uncanny accuracy. "I know you came here expecting to marry Samuel Hartwell. I can't be him, can't offer you the life he promised. But I can offer you something real, a partnership based on who we actually are rather than who we thought we should be." Margaret felt tears forming as she recognized the proposal hidden within his careful words. "David Morrison, are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking if you'd consider building a permanent life together, whatever form that takes," he replied with characteristic honesty. "Territorial liaison positions, community leadership, forge work, family, all of it together, based on the partnership we've already proven works." Margaret's answer came without hesitation, born from months of growing certainty about the man who had seen her clearly from their first meeting. "Yes, to all of it. To you, to us, to whatever we can build together." Their kiss sealed more than romantic commitment. It affirmed their evolution from broken individuals seeking shelter to partners capable of leading others toward justice and hope. Samuel Hartwell's death had brought them together, but their own choices had forged something strong enough to withstand corporate intimidation, community doubt, and personal fear. As winter deepened around their mountain valley, Margaret Sinclair and David Morrison planned both their wedding and their expanded mission as territorial liaisons for homestead protection. They had proven that love could grow from shared purpose, that strength could emerge from acknowledged weakness, that the most enduring partnerships were built on mutual respect rather than conventional attraction. The mail-order bride with burn, scars, and the blind blacksmith had found something more valuable than the life either had originally sought: the courage to help others discover that their own scars, whether visible or hidden, could become sources of wisdom, strength, and ultimately, transformation. In the territory where individual survival often seemed like the highest possible achievement, they had demonstrated that building community and defending justice offered deeper satisfaction than mere personal success. Their story would inspire other isolated families throughout Colorado Territory and beyond, proving that ordinary people united around common purpose could successfully resist forces that seemed overwhelmingly powerful. Most importantly, they had learned that the greatest discoveries come not from finding what we think we're seeking, but from being brave enough to build something entirely new from the ashes of our broken expectations. The woman who had fled, Boston in shame, had become a leader whose scars testified to survival and strength. The man who had lost his sight but gained deeper vision had found a partner who saw him as completely as he saw her. Together, they faced whatever challenges, awaited with the unshakable confidence that comes from knowing that love, real love, sees clearly, regardless of what mirrors might reflect. 6 months later, the Colorado Territory Courthouse in Denver buzzed with unprecedented activity as Margaret Morrison stood before a packed gallery, delivering testimony that would reshape homestead protection laws throughout the American West. Her scarred face, once a source of shame, now commanded respect as she presented evidence of corporate land fraud that had taken her and David across 12 counties, helping 43 communities organize successful resistance against illegal seizures. Honorable judges, Margaret addressed the territorial Supreme Court with the confidence of someone who had learned to wield truth as powerfully as any weapon. The evidence before you represents more than individual cases of corporate overreach. It reveals a systematic campaign to use fraudulent legal claims and armed intimidation to steal property from families who built homes and livelihoods through honest labor. Attorney General Brennan had called this hearing the most important land rights case in territorial history, with implications extending far beyond Colorado's borders. Margaret's documentation methods, developed during their fight against consolidated mining, had become the standard for exposing corporate fraud throughout the region. Her partnership with David had evolved into something unprecedented, a husband and wife team whose combined skills in investigation, organization, and community building had made them the territory's most effective advocates for homestead protection. David sat in the front row, his enhanced hearing tracking every nuance of the proceedings, while his spatial memory created mental maps of the courtroom's dynamics. Despite his blindness, he had become renowned for his ability to detect inconsistencies in witness testimony and identify crucial evidence that sighted investigators missed. Corporate lawyers had learned to fear his methodical questioning and uncanny ability to expose lies through careful analysis of vocal patterns and logical contradictions. "Mrs. Morrison," interrupted Judge Hamilton Pierce, the court's senior member, "your testimony suggests that Consolidated Mining's activities represent just one example of a broader pattern of land fraud. Can you substantiate such a sweeping claim?" Margaret had anticipated this challenge and was prepared with evidence that would shock even experienced legal minds. "Your Honor, our investigation has documented similar fraudulent schemes in 8 states and territories, all following identical patterns and often involving the same corporate entities using different names." She gestured toward a massive display chart that David had helped her design, showing connections between dozens of seemingly separate companies, all traced back to a single financial consortium based in New York. Their months of traveling to threatened communities had revealed a conspiracy far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The Westfield Investment Group controls over 40 subsidiary corporations, each specializing in acquiring land through questionable legal claims, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger as she exposed the scope of the conspiracy. They target isolated communities with limited legal resources, use intimidation and sabotage to pressure homesteaders into selling, then exploit mineral or timber resources before abandoning the land as worthless. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs as spectators realized the implications of her revelations. Many had traveled from across the territory to witness this hearing, representing communities that had faced similar threats. Margaret's testimony was validating their experiences, while providing hope that justice might finally address systematic corporate abuse. Judge Pierce called for order before addressing Margaret again. "These are serious allegations, Mrs. Morrison. I trust you have evidence to support such claims?" David rose from his seat, moving with the confident precision that never failed to command attention. "Your Honor, if I may assist my wife in presenting the evidence we've gathered over the past 6 months. Please proceed, Mr. Morrison." David approached the evidence table with documents organized according to his intricate filing system, each piece of paper positioned exactly where his fingers expected to find it. "We have authenticated contracts, forged geological surveys, falsified federal permits, and testimony from over 200 witnesses across multiple territories. The pattern is consistent and undeniable." Margaret watched her husband work with the pride that had grown deeper through every challenge they had faced together. David's analytical mind and her organizational skills had proven an unstoppable combination in exposing corporate fraud. More importantly, their marriage had demonstrated that partnerships built on mutual respect and complementary strengths could achieve things neither individual could accomplish alone. Furthermore, David continued, producing a leather portfolio that contained their most damaging evidence. We have obtained internal correspondence from Westfield Investment Group that explicitly describes their strategy of targeting isolated homesteaders with questionable legal representation and limited financial resources for extended litigation. The lead attorney for Consolidated Mining, a sharp-faced man named Cornelius Blackwood, leaped to his feet in objection. "Your Honor, the defense has not been given opportunity to examine these allegedly internal documents. We question both their authenticity and the legal methods used to obtain them." Margaret smiled, having anticipated this challenge as well. "Mr. Blackwood, these documents were provided voluntarily by former Westfield employees who grew disturbed by the company's illegal activities. Each has been authenticated by federal document experts and is accompanied by sworn affidavits from the sources." The afternoon session continued with devastating testimony from whistleblowers who had worked within the corporate conspiracy. Margaret had spent weeks convincing these witnesses to come forward, using her gift for inspiring trust and David's ability to analyze their motivations to build cases for cooperation rather than continued complicity. Elena Vasquez, a former surveyor for Westfield subsidiaries, described how she had been ordered to falsify geological reports to justify land seizures. "They told me to find mineral deposits whether they existed or not," she testified, her voice shaking with emotion. "When I refused to lie about survey results, they threatened my family and destroyed my professional reputation." Marcus Wright, a former Westfield legal clerk, provided even more damaging testimony about forged federal documents and bribed territorial officials. The company maintained detailed records of which judges and government clerks had been purchased, he revealed. They called it their cooperation database and used it to ensure favorable rulings in disputed land cases. Margaret felt profound satisfaction as she watched the corporate conspiracy unravel under the weight of evidence she and David had painstakingly assembled. Their investigation had required months of dangerous travel through remote territories, interviews with hundreds of threatened families, and careful analysis of thousands of documents. The work had been exhausting and sometimes terrifying, but it had also been the most meaningful activity of her life. During a recess, she stepped outside the courthouse to find David surrounded by a group of homesteaders seeking advice about protecting their own communities. Despite his blindness, he had become a magnetic figure whose reputation for wisdom and fairness drew people seeking guidance through complex challenges. "The key is organization," David was explaining to a rancher from the Wyoming Territory. "Individual families can be isolated and overwhelmed, but communities working together become much harder to intimidate or deceive." Margaret joined the group, adding her own perspective to David's advice. "Document everything, communicate constantly with your neighbors, and never accept legal claims at face value without independent verification. Corporate lawyers depend on people being too overwhelmed or frightened to investigate their assertions." A young woman with calloused hands and determined eyes approached Margaret directly. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm Sarah Hendricks from the Montana settlements. We're facing the same kind of pressure you fought in Colorado. Would you consider coming to help us organize our defense?" The request represented exactly the kind of opportunity that had driven Margaret and David to accept their territorial liaison positions. Each community they helped became stronger, but more importantly, each success inspired other threatened settlements to believe that resistance was possible. "We'll be there," Margaret promised, feeling David's approving nod beside her. "No community should have to face corporate intimidation alone." When court reconvened, Judge Pierce delivered a preliminary ruling that exceeded even Margaret's optimistic expectations. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds probable cause to believe that systematic fraud has been perpetrated against homesteaders throughout this territory and beyond. We are ordering immediate suspension of all land seizures based on Westfield Investment Group claims pending federal investigation. The courtroom erupted in cheers as homesteaders realized their properties were protected, at least temporarily, from corporate seizure. Margaret felt tears of relief and triumph as she watched families embrace, knowing their homes were safe for the immediate future. But Judge Pierce wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court is recommending federal prosecution of Westfield Investment Group and all subsidiary corporations for conspiracy, fraud, and violation of homestead laws. The evidence suggests criminal activity on a scale that requires federal rather than territorial response. Margaret and David exchanged glances of profound satisfaction. Their investigation had not only protected threatened communities, but had exposed a criminal conspiracy that could result in prison sentences for the corporate executives who had terrorized honest families across the American West. As the formal proceedings concluded, Attorney General Brennan approached them with an unexpected proposition. The federal government wants to expand your liaison positions into a full investigative bureau, he explained. What you've accomplished here proves that systematic corporate fraud requires specialized response teams with your unique combination of skills. David tilted his head thoughtfully. You're suggesting we become federal agents? I'm suggesting you become the foundation for a new type of law enforcement, Brennan clarified. Teams that specialize in protecting homesteader rights and exposing corporate crimes against rural communities. Your methods could be taught to others, expanded across multiple territories. Margaret considered the proposal with excitement and some trepidation. Federal authority would provide resources and legal power far beyond what they currently possessed, but it would also mean even greater responsibilities and dangers. We'd want to maintain our community-based approach, she said carefully. The most important work happens at the local level, building trust and teaching people to protect themselves. Absolutely, Brennan agreed. But imagine having federal backing for that work, with teams trained in your methods operating throughout the West. You could transform how America protects its most vulnerable citizens. That evening, Margaret and David celebrated their legal victory at Denver's finest hotel, though their conversation focused more on future possibilities than past achievements. They had proven that individual determination, combined with community organization, could defeat apparently overwhelming corporate power. Now they faced the opportunity to institutionalize that success on a national scale. Are you ready to become federal agents? Margaret asked as they shared a quiet dinner in their hotel room. David's smile carried both anticipation and deep contentment. I'm ready for whatever allows us to continue this work together. The specific title matters less than the mission. Margaret reached across the table to take his hand, marveling again at how perfectly their fingers intertwined. Samuel's letters promised me acceptance and partnership with someone who valued character over appearance. I found something infinitely better, a true partner who sees my scars as proof of strength rather than evidence of damage. And I found someone who taught me that losing my sight didn't mean losing my purpose, David replied, his voice rich with emotion. You showed me that disabilities become abilities when they're channeled toward meaningful work. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at their door. Margaret opened it to find Elena Vasquez, the surveyor who had testified earlier, accompanied by two other women she didn't recognize. Mrs. Morrison, Elena said with obvious nervousness, I hope we're not intruding, but we wanted to thank you personally for giving us the courage to speak out, For the first time in years, we feel like we might actually be safe from retaliation. Margaret invited the women inside, genuinely moved by their gratitude. You gave yourselves the courage. We just provided a framework for using it effectively. One of Elena's companions, a middle-aged woman with intelligent eyes, stepped forward. I'm Dr. Catherine Mills, and I've been following your work throughout the territory. I represent a group of professional women who are interested in supporting your mission through financial contributions and volunteer assistance. David joined their conversation with obvious interest. What kind of support are you envisioning? Legal services, medical care for threatened communities, educational programs for children in isolated settlements, Dr. Mills explained. We believe that protecting homesteader rights requires more than just legal victories. It requires building social infrastructure that makes rural communities sustainable and self-sufficient. Margaret felt excitement building as she recognized the potential for expanding their mission beyond crisis response into community development. You're talking about creating comprehensive support systems that prevent problems rather than just responding to them. Exactly, Dr. Mills confirmed. And we believe your model of partnership, combining different skills and perspectives to achieve common goals, could revolutionize how professional women contribute to frontier development. As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself at the center of discussions that extended far beyond her original mission of helping David rebuild Samuel's forge. She had become a catalyst for social change, inspiring others to envision new forms of community organization and professional collaboration. I never imagined that my scars would become credentials, she confided to David after their visitors departed. But people seem to trust someone who has obviously survived difficulties and emerged stronger. Your scars are proof that you understand, suffering without being broken by it, David replied thoughtfully. That's exactly the kind of leadership people need when facing their own challenges. 3 days later, Margaret and David stood before a federal commission in Washington, D.C., presenting their proposal for a National Homestead Protection Bureau. The capital city's marble buildings and political grandeur felt alien after months in frontier communities, but Margaret had learned to carry her mountain-bred confidence into any environment. Honorable commissioners, she addressed the panel of federal officials, the evidence from Colorado Territory demonstrates that homesteader rights cannot be protected through traditional law enforcement methods. Corporate land fraud requires specialized investigation techniques and community-based response strategies. Senator James Crawford, the commission's chairman, leaned forward with obvious interest. Mrs. Morrison, your background seems quite unusual for someone proposing federal law enforcement reforms. How did a former seamstress from Boston become an expert in corporate investigation? Margaret had faced similar questions throughout their journey, and she had learned to use her unconventional background as evidence of the broader potential she advocated. Senator Crawford, my expertise comes from necessity rather than formal training. When corporations threaten ordinary families, those families need advocates who understand their situations personally rather than theoretically. David added his own perspective to her response. Traditional law enforcement often approaches homesteader protection from the wrong direction. They focus on technical legal questions rather than community dynamics. Our success comes from building trust at the local level and then applying that understanding to expose broader patterns of abuse. Commissioner Sarah Whitman, one of 3 women on the panel, asked a question that went to the heart of their proposal. How do you envision training other agents in your methods? Can these community-based approaches be systematized without losing their effectiveness? Margaret had spent weeks developing her answer to this crucial question. Commissioner Whitman, the key is selecting agents who already understand hardship and community cooperation. People who have faced significant challenges themselves tend to be more effective at inspiring trust and cooperation from threatened families. You're suggesting that federal agents should be recruited from frontier communities rather than established law enforcement? Senator Crawford asked with some skepticism. I'm suggesting that the most effective protectors of rural communities are people who come from rural communities, Margaret replied firmly. Technical training can be taught, but understanding and empathy must be lived. The Commission's questioning continued for over 3 hours, covering everything from budget requirements to constitutional authority for federal intervention in land disputes. Margaret and David answered each challenge with evidence drawn from their practical experience, demonstrating that their methods produced measurable results in protecting vulnerable communities. When the formal hearing concluded, Commissioner Whitman approached them privately with encouraging news. Your proposal has strong support within the administration. President Cleveland believes that protecting homesteader rights is essential for maintaining American democratic values against corporate consolidation. Margaret felt profound satisfaction in knowing that their work had reached the highest levels of government. When do you expect a decision on implementation? Within 6 weeks, Commissioner Whitman replied. But I can tell you confidentially that the primary question isn't whether to establish the Bureau, but how quickly it can be operational. That evening, Margaret and David walked through Washington's streets, marveling at how far they had traveled from the burned cabin where they had first met. Their partnership had evolved from desperate cooperation into transformative leadership that was reshaping federal policy toward rural communities. Do you ever wonder what Samuel would think of what we've built from his letters? Margaret asked, as they paused before the Capitol building. David's expression grew thoughtful. I think Samuel would be amazed that his simple desire to find a partner who valued character over appearance led to a movement that's protecting thousands of families across the American West. Margaret nodded, understanding that their story had transcended personal triumph to become something larger and more enduring. We came together as broken people seeking shelter. We discovered that our scars, physical and emotional, actually equipped us to help others heal from their own wounds. 6 weeks later, President Grover Cleveland signed the Homestead Protection Act, establishing the National Homestead Protection Bureau with Margaret and David Morrison as its founding directors. Their mountain cabin became the Bureau's first regional headquarters, proving that effective federal programs could be administered from rural communities rather than distant urban centers. The mail-order bride with burn scars and the blind blacksmith had not only found love and purpose together, they had demonstrated that America's greatest strength lay not in corporate power, but in the courage of ordinary people united around principles of justice and mutual support. Their legacy would inspire generations of federal agents who understood that protecting the vulnerable required more than legal authority. It demanded the wisdom that comes only from personal experience with hardship, hope, and ultimate triumph over seemingly impossible odds. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.